We are going straight into our first session, which I'm calling Predictive Institutions. And the introduction to this is the following. Change keeps changing, but do institutions manage to change at their necessary pace? Should they even try? The pandemic induced sudden pressure and forced museums to pivot to digital content production, much of which is here to stay. Now, new media such as NFTs challenge legacy institutions' capacity to re-educate themselves. What are our expectations of institutions to log the quickening past and incubate what is to come? I have three of my favorite human beings on stage, and I realized this morning that in a sense they represent also different time spans of my life. I think I've known Brendan McGetrick for over 20 years now. Certainly when Brendan was working at AMO, which is the kind of research think tank part of OMA, Rem Koolhaas's architectural practice. And at the time, Brendan, you edited content. And I wrote a piece about indecent proposal. And more recently, for about a decade, I've known Chiara Costa, who's the head of programs at the Fondazione Prada, where I also have the privilege of thinking in a thought council with other wonderful people, such as Lucia, who you will meet straight after this session. And much more recently, maybe not even a year yet, Lukas Amacher, who's a curator and head of a really super interesting and also, in a sense, one of these arguably new para or post-institutional institutions, which is called One of One Works. I'm going to keep the biographical introductions very, very brief because in a sense I've asked them to present themselves through their institutions and through their kind of practices. So one by one, they're going to give us short presentations. And then I have a number of questions, and I'm sure you do as well, to follow up. But first, will you please join me in welcoming Brendan, Chiara, and Lukas. So if we could maybe have Chiara's presentation first up on the screen. Thank you so much. Chiara, over to you.
Thank you, Shumon, first of all, for inviting me, and thank you to all the organizers at the Global Art Forum, especially Fatima, who was extremely kind and efficient. First of all, I'd like to briefly introduce you to what the Fondazione Prada is, which is a way for me to say, quoting Shumon, how change kept changing in this institution for the past 30 years. So these are the physical spaces where we organize our activities at the moment, our projects. But there is also a number of activities that happened elsewhere. So this is the venue in Milan with a specific space for kids designed after a long research that also Shumon witnessed based on the necessities and the fantasy of kids. This is a cinema which has started a new program recently with a new curator, Paolo Moretti, who comes from straight, let's say, from the Kanzen in Cannes. And this has been an amazing moment for us because for the first time, we're meeting the audience of the cinema, and it's a big one. So that's why I'm proud to show this image. And this is something that some of you may have seen, is the Bar Luce, which is the cafeteria at the Fondazione designed by Wes Anderson. As I said, we have other venues. One is in the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele, downtown Milan. It's mostly a space devoted to the production of contemporary images. But we also have a venue which is very important for us in Venice, and also in Shanghai, Ronzai, which is a space actually that belongs to Prada, but where we organize cultural activities twice a year, and same thing for the city of Tokyo. So the Fondazione was founded in 1995, so almost 30 years ago, based on a long-term interest in culture and contemporary art. In the first years, it concentrated mostly on 2 major projects per year. So that is why I kept here, like the last project that Dan Flavin organized, created in a church in Milan, or same thing, a project that Laurie Anderson did in Milan, which was about the someone in a prison in Milan, basically virtually in 98 escaping the prison and appearing at the Fondazione Prada. And probably, as a lot of you have seen, mostly on Instagram, I have to say, this is a work from 2000 that is now really appearing every day on Instagram. And I like this because, in a way, it's an old work. It has 23 years, and in contemporary art, it's quite a lot, but still, it really looks, in my opinion, extremely contemporary and fresh, let's say. We have also been interested in other topics, cultural topics like cinema, architecture, or philosophy. But I would say a major change in the cultural politics of the Fondazione happened in 2013 when we opened venue in Venice, Ca Corner della Regina. And we activated this space with a what I think is one of the most ambitious projects that the Fondazione ever organized, which was basically the remake of a 1969 exhibition, which happened in Switzerland, in Bern, curated by Harald Zeman. It was a kind of almost obsessive philological remake of the original show, as much as it was possible to. And that was the first time that we worked on so explicitly and also ironically on questioning the art system as it is today. Also, of course, this is to me a landmark because it brought on the foreground a very important question, which is why do we make exhibitions and why do we still keep doing exhibitions? This morning we were talking to Hans-Ulrich Obrist and we were saying that most of the times exhibitions can be barely sustainable. So we really have to find a reason why we keep doing this. And of course, it's a question mark, and I'm not going to give you an answer, basically, not today for sure. The research on this idea of replicas kept on until we made this exhibition, which inaugurated the new premises that Rem Koolhaas and OMA have reinterpreted. I say reinterpreted because this complex used to be a distillery back in the early 20th century. And we opened a contemporary art space with an archaeology show, basically, which was already, in my opinion, a kind of a statement. There have been a number of shows that followed, which to me, I'm going to show you just the ones that to me were more relevant thinking about today's topic, Goshka Matsuga. Edward Kinholz, this is a work that was made in 1972, an extremely violent work which depicts, doesn't just depict, actually the viewer enters it, and it's a brutal scene of some man with a mask attacking a black man. This was a project that Alejandro Iñárritu organized with the Fondazione. It was a VR project one-person experience in which the people would get in with the glasses and basically experience what it means to be a migrant that has to cross a border between Mexico and the US. There are a number of other projects, but I'll try to be as fast as possible. This is probably the moment, I would say, before everything changed. So I became head of programs in 2019. I worked on what I thought was a very good and interesting program for the next 3-4 years. We had just opened the Studio d'Orphée by Jean-Luc Godard. And then all of a sudden, of course, everything changed and my program, let's say, disappeared. So the question that had moved the Fondazione since the beginning was always, what is a cultural institution for? And during that time, of course, we had to rethink a lot about this question. So the temporary closure of the exhibition forced us to work, to move basically online. So we did cinema programs with Mubi, we did visual essays on YouTube called Finite Rents. We also did an exhibition through Instagram stories with Francesco Vezzoli, and a number of other projects that, like a series of podcasts, which was what we could do in terms of editorial activities. We only went back in 2021 with physical exhibitions with Simon Fujiwara, Useless Bodies, an exhibition by Elmgren and Draxet. And by the way, this is a project, this installation had been conceived in 2017, so you can imagine how it looked like in 2022, a completely different meaning, which really was in its time. And we just closed this week an exhibition about the idea of recycling art from antiquity to the later times and the Middle Age, but which is basically about recycling the symbols of power. I think what is an interesting case study for today is a project called Human Brains, which we started in 2018. The project was conceived in 4 phases, and of course we had to adapt it because of the pandemic. So the 2020 activities, which were thought to be in presence, became completely online, but they turned into, quoting Shumon again, a huge media online initiative. So there was like a week-long conference in 2020, a year-long series of conference the year after, an exhibition in Venice while the Venice Biennale was taking place. And it ended in October, last October, with a forum about neurodegenerative diseases, organized in collaboration with 13 international centers across the world who work on neuroscience and the studies of our brain. So I'm saying it ended. It didn't really end, because in a month we're going to open a new chapter of this research in Shanghai in collaboration with the Tianjin Medical University in General Hospital in China. So, but that's another story, basically. So I would say, in the beginning, the aim of the project was to underline the importance of cooperation and disseminate meaningful studies, I would say. But then it became more and more specific, and also it became more and more clear that it was not possible to answer to all these questions that the project raised. So we work with both a historical and I would say scientific and historical perspective. And by historical, I also mean include the present. And we tried to explain what we know so far about the brain. We tried to explain how we got to know it. And we tried to explain or figure out what we may know in a short time. So, and I'm almost done. With this project, I think we tried to shed light on science, meaning on its extreme complexity, on how the evolution of knowledge requires, and this is crucial to me, a continuous verification process, how each new acquisition is the premise for the next, and this is, a never-ending development. So this is, I believe, is something that can strongly be related to what we're talking about today, which is the idea of predicting the present. Basically, in my opinion, for an institution, it's about being aware that you have to carefully choose what is relevant for you today to work on. Thank you.
Thank you. It's uncanny because what you just said about relevance was something I wanted to share, I guess, with the audience, which it's one of Mrs. Prada's most sort of repeated phrases. No, there are certain kind of phrases that she often returns to both publicly and privately in conversations that we have. One is that culture is not a luxury but a necessity. right? Which is a kind of a quite provocative thing to say, particularly at a point, I mean, as a private institution, at a time where many parts of the world are seeing, arts funding from the public sector completely decimated. We're seeing also the decimation of humanities, not only in primary and secondary education, but even at higher education. Like, why should you study Latin? Why should you study history, et cetera, right? So, because the argument there would be actually culture is a luxury, and learning coding or whatever is a necessity. And then the second thing she always, I guess, asks us again and again, is what is relevant? Can you explore what you think she means by that word and how you interpret relevance?
I'll say it very briefly. I would say that if we had to look for a keyword, it wouldn't be exhibiting, it wouldn't be experiencing, it would be learning. So that's what it's all about. Why do you do an exhibition? To have people think about it when they leave. And same thing for temporary projects. I mean, everything like art, everything that we organize and work on, which is art, science, philosophy, cinema, whatever, needs that element. It is about learning.
Which is another key word that we can maybe discuss about our possible future project. I'd like to introduce and welcome Lukas now to take us through, in a way, as I say, a very different. It would be debatable whether we would even use the word institution. We could talk about that, whether that's a sort of something semantically you would agree with or not. But anyway, over to you, Lukas, please. Thank you.
I am absolutely flattered that you would call us an institution, whether it's a post or para or whatever. I actually prefer post than para.
Post institution, yeah.
But I'm not sure I ever considered it in that light. But I don't know how many of you are in crypto, but the institutions are coming is an extremely old trope, a meme that never dies. This is actually from a CoinDesk article in 2019, where every last single ICO was screaming at the top of their lungs about the institutions. Blockchains for banks, blockchains for supply chains, blockchains for dentists. Obviously, they were wrong. Like the best museums in the world, the blockchain was designed to be a public space. And designing a blockchain for an institution is as ridiculous as building an art museum for dentists. And so this old trope, this old never-dying meme, the institutions are coming, has gotten recently an update in the bull run of 2020 and 21. Now they're not coming for your fungible tokens, they're coming for your non-fungible tokens. And the narrative is that the first real working use case that we've seen in crypto is selling art and media on chain, and that's the only one that works, and therefore everything of early importance must be very valuable. And this, I think, is something that we're trying to find out whether this is true or not, and we're sifting through a lot of artwork and otherwise work. And the keyword here is obviously updates. When thinking about the never-ending present, so keep that in mind. And Shumon asked me to give you a quick kind of overview of what one of one, our collection is, and then talk about the thing that we're most associated with, which is Human One, an artwork by people. I'd say one of one is a collection that of digital art primarily that deals with the chicken and egg problem of on versus offline worlds. In an age where public offline space that is increasingly permeated by narratives and ideals that only make sense online, the chicken and egg problem seems to loom at every corner. What should exhibitions, collections, and other kind of long-term focused cultural initiatives optimize for? Is it physical attendance? Is it digital likes? Is it memeability? Is it deep thought criticism? Is it all of the above? I don't know. My hunch is that the chicken and egg problem is in fact not a problem, but the solution, and everybody will simply have to do both. So One of One finds itself operating in 4 different kind of pillars, I would say. One is really the collection was enabled through NFTs, because for the first time in history, it to us made sense to collect digital artifacts and items. We kind of not only collect, but also try to support the artists we collect, taking kind of cues from the venture capital company that incubated One of One. We want to both be like value add and also activist collectors, because one observation that the advent of NFTs have brought over the last 2 years is that while offline artists rely on a really large and kind of well-oiled network of galleries and museums and foundries and production facilities to realize their ideas and bring them to life, digital artists absolutely lack those counterparts. There are no real institutions online. There's very few people that can actually help you advance, and like smart contract coders are an extremely rare, scarce resource. And so deep expertise on the possibilities and mechanisms of the blockchain are extremely unevenly distributed. As a collection, I think we can help with that. Institutional collaboration becomes the third kind of ring of what we do. Even though some of the Twitterverse might think it's different, we all know that art history didn't start with the CryptoPunks. It in fact started with cave painting. And so to us, it's pretty clear that the contextualization and mediation of our time's artistic development, which happens to a large part online, has to be part of a larger discourse and will happen in institutions. Whether these are digital or physical, we will see. So in order to help our artists break out of the Twitterverse, collaborations with the bigger kind of museums of the world are a big focus. I'll dive into that in a minute. And the last pillar is kind of figuring out how to natively work with the financing mechanisms available in this new paradigm. You asked me specifically to dive into that, which I will. And the keyword here is composability. If you don't know what that means, it's basically the blockchain is built in a way where every problem only has to be solved once, and all kind of solutions to a problem can be stacked like Lego. And so owning a token, whatever token it is, it can be used through various applications throughout the whole blockchain ecosystem. And so, what you would traditionally consider an art loan on a Warhol can now be done natively online in a very kind of easy, fast way. Before I move on, did you notice the wonderful colors on my slide? I, of course, lifted them from the OG of NFTs, Mr. So Lewitt. He sold artwork as a certificate of ownership. He wasn't the first one, but I think he's still one of the ones that does it the most beautifully. In fact, owning a So Lewitt wall drawing is not worth anything if you don't have the piece of paper. And with NFTs, it kind of works in a similar way. The piece One of One is most associated with is Human One. In essence, it's a video featuring an explorer walking through an ever-changing landscape, and that is accessible in various ways. Composability says that you can access your tokens through a marketplace. You can access your tokens through a website of the artist, for example, or for the tech-savvy of you, you can access a token through a block explorer, which is essentially a place where you can find all the information that is put on chain. That is obviously not for everyone, but it is a kind of like a last resort to find out what is stored. Human One is also a kinetic sculpture that people like to take selfies in front of. This is at M+ in Hong Kong at the opening last December. It obviously changes the relationship to what the work is entirely, because it's not just an on-blind video. It is in fact something that you stand in front of and something that you have a relationship with. It's been at Castello di Rivoli in Turin. The photographer did a wonderful job in highlighting the Francis Bacon in the background and blurring out Human One. And then, of course, another proper shot from M+. And you may notice that the explorer each time is in a different landscape, and the person looks slightly different. And here in this specific instance, you actually see a little sticker of Castello di Rivoli on the backpack, and that is because Human One is a continuously updating piece. So the continuous update of a piece kind of has a few implications that are in a way contradictory to how we think of conservation of artistic ideas up to this day. Human One becomes a parable of why we're stuck in this 10th circle of Dante's hell, the everlasting present. And the word is, of course, updates. We might have just entered into an age where objects are never finished, where they continuously evolve, and where they're not, in fact, the Francis Bacon on the wall that is done and reference a specific time, but where they are continuously living things. Human One changes not just by decay, but by evolution. And that also obviously changes the idea of the identity, or let's not say changes, but maybe say confronts the identity of the institutions that Human One deals with. Should change by evolution become a new paradigm in creation, the museum has to evolve from a groundskeeper and a keeper of records to a facilitator of an ever-changing experience. The museum almost becomes a shaman, and we're left with the question, how does the concept of updates update the institutions? Interestingly enough, Human One not only needs a different institution, it also needs a different collector, one that collects upfront rather than after the fact, one that is happy to put up the money when only a few % of the piece are actually done, and where there's no fixed battle plan on how to complete it. Human One, in essence, needs a collaborator more than it needs a collector, and that's evident in the question of, if something updated in a free port and no one sees it, has it updated at all? So collaboration is kind of a key part in the idea of an ever-evolving object, and it comes out in Human One in different ways. These are 5 different everydays of People's series. People famously makes a artwork every day that is accessible through his website and through his Instagram account. And he actually mints very few of them. So very few of those artworks are for sale. In Human One, so there was 5 Human One updates so far, and each iteration of Human One contains a riddle. Finding and solving these riddles leads you to a seed phrase, which is your access key to a crypto wallet. And in that crypto wallet, you will find an NFT, which is an edition 1 of 2. So previously, he has minted 5 NFTs in an edition of 2 that were hidden in his work. This is quite it also plays to this time-sensitive updatability. Because the old videos of Human One disappear, you only have a given time frame to find the clues that lead you to these NFTs. And the incentive is actually rather high. Like an everyday of people these days goes for $200,000. And so the 2 NFTs, if a riddle solver finds them, one goes to the person who solved the riddle, one goes to the original collector. So the digital paradigm here is that you can create an artwork that keeps creating new artworks that, in essence, over a very long time horizon, if the market remains stable, finances itself. Just to give you an idea of, there's only been 1 of the riddles have been solved. It was the furthest left one, a human was born. It was actually during the opening at Castello. You would see a little light on the foot of Human One. Human One was walking and the light is blinking, and it turned out that the blinking light was actually Morse code. And that was half of the seed phrase. And then for a quarter second or so on the backpack of Human One, there was a QR code that was the other half of the seed phrase. Speaking of financial components, composability is a big topic, and there is something there that could also be very relevant for institutions, because it kind of unlocks financing mechanisms that could be thought natively on chain, that are more than just memberships, etc. This is a loan where we borrowed $250,000 on people's stick milking factory, also an everyday at the interest rate of 2% over 3 months. And we use the funds in another investment scheme that we have, a delta neutral stablecoin yield farming fund that produces well more than 2% interest rate. And so in essence, what we're trying to figure out is how can we use the collection as collateral, or parts of the collection as collateral, to use the yield of what we borrow to keep on collecting. So best case, you kind of build a self-building collection. This is Charles VII. After him, it was the term was coined. The king is dead, long live the king. His father died, he took the throne. Here he's playing Minecraft. And the question kind of after this whole market extravaganza of the last 2 years is the king really dead? Are NFTs gone? Is digital art not a thing? Given the attendance here, I think it still is. And given what happened the last 12 months worldwide with a lot of very venerable institutions, that kind of proves my point. We've had Costello and M+, who did Human One. We've had Kunsthalle Zurich, who did a big show on NFTs called Do Your Own Research. We've had obviously Rafik at the MoMA, Punks at the ICA, and then 2 large acquisitions at the Pompidou and the LACMA. I'll close with something you all know. Even the most analog and traditional of paintings is constantly being digitized every day. And so I think we all have to think very strongly about which part of this image is the chicken, which part of this image is the egg, and how we move forward from here.
Thank you. Thank you, Lukas. I'm glad. I love this. We could just talk about updates in a way, because I had a sort of question which we could get into maybe later after Brendan's thing, but it's just something to think about, which is the difference between hardware and software. And it's something I've thought a lot about this whole time I've been in the region, because there's a sense in which, very crudely put, hardware would be something like architecture, building, and there's a way in which you can quite tactilely accelerate that process. If you need a building, if a building used to go up in 3 years, you can figure out how to make it go up in a year just by throwing enough resources at it, manpower, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes I think there's a misunderstanding that you could do the same thing with software, i.e. the content of an institution, right? So, but actually they operate very, very sort of differently. And of course, we now live in a time when maybe the hard boundary between, what's hardware and what's software on here, I'm sure we've all been through moments where your devices are forcibly updated, but you actually preferred the version, the operating system or something before, but there's no way to go back. And I suppose in a way, I'm using this as also, I guess, as a segue for Brendan and the Museum of the Future, which is, obviously inextricably linked to the multiple meanings and interpretations of what technology has been, is, and will be, perhaps. But maybe that's something we could explore a little bit. Last but not least, therefore, Brandon McGetrick, creative director of the Museum of the Future. Some of you will have visited already. Some of you will have wanted to visit, but you can't because it's constantly sold out, which I think is a real testament to its kind of incredible instant sort of success. And we can also maybe just discuss what success might mean, how we measure success. But Brendan, please, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Okay, I will. I'm not going to show a huge amount of photos of the museum, so I'm going to consolidate it in a single video and then just talk over the video. So this is the museum. We opened a year ago. To cut a long story short, it's a sort of initiative of the Dubai government, and at the highest level, what it's trying to do is encourage people to come and feel that the future is important and that they are important to the future. So it's an attempt to create experiences which are intimate enough, personal enough, and at the same time kind of broad enough that people can imagine, A, that they're possible, but B, that they could play a significant role in making them happen. So the majority of the exhibition experience is really creating future environments that take place in the year 2071. And you visit them and you participate in them and you become a kind of temporary explorer or resident of those futures. And they're sort of only truly complete through your participation. And there's a number of different themes and things like that. I won't get into all these details, but just to say that a lot of what the museum is trying to do is mobilize various technologies, various storylines, and various ways of display and experience to encourage people to feel that the future is there and is something that we create together. It's not a sort of place that we're going to, it's a place that we're making all the time in our thoughts and in our actions. And so there's a children's floor, there's various other aspects of the museum as an institution, but from a kind of conceptual point of view, that's what it's founded on. And I think it's important to say that, as the creative director, it was really challenging, but also, inspiring to come to an institution that A, didn't exist, but B, had a very, very clear sense of what it was supposed to be. How was totally unclear, but what it was supposed to achieve on the kind of public service, public engagement level was very clear. So I'll just talk a little bit about how we did it. So on one hand, most of what you experience, or at least on 3 floors of the museum, would be called immersive experiences. Immersive is this kind of buzzword, absolutely unavoidable, pretty much empty. And so we knew that we were making immersive experiences. Immersive is a term that really comes out of the digital world. So when you're making a physical museum, it actually doesn't make any sense to talk about immersive experiences because you're immersed anyway. We're immersed right now. You're immersed all the time. So we didn't aspire to this. And also we wanted to distinguish ourselves from other kind of venues and places which really go hardcore for immersion. And so we kind of developed a different term called expansive experiences. And the difference between immersive and expansive is really about the quality of this space, the quality of the experience itself, the environment that you create. Do you feel immersed in a storyline, in an idea, or whatever? Expansive experience is really about the effect that has on you. And for the museum, what we were really trying to do is mobilize all the elements that we would create, all the objects and settings and scenes and interactions, to encourage people to have an expanded sense of what is possible for the future, what is possible for themselves. So that's sort of what it is trying to do. And all of these kind of immersive techniques, which we did use, of course, are sort of mobilized toward that end, which is really, again, about the effect that you have, not so much about the quality of the experience itself. Shumon was trotting out so many new terms, so I'm going to do it too, although it's not my own term. It's from Francois Hartog. So the idea is presentism. So I think this is the first thing I thought about when I saw the title of this series. So I'll just read this. Presentism is a sense that only the present exists, a present characterized at once by the tyranny of the instant and by the treadmill of an unending now. In the 21st century, the future is not a radiant horizon guiding our advancing steps, but rather a line of shadow drawing closer. So this is a really important point, particularly about the Museum of the Future, because one of the things that the museum is trying to do is respond to this phenomenon as an intellectual phenomenon, but more than anything as an emotional phenomenon. Because I think we can all agree that we sort of live in a golden age of dystopia. Our media is almost entirely defined by it. Film, literature, I could show video games too. we are kind of in an age when our best brains are sort of applying their intelligence and their sensitivity and imagination towards showing how much worse things can get. And the museum is a very explicit manifesto against that. And so what we believed when we were making it is that you can be as sensitive and as insightful about the anxieties and pressures that define the present, but you can channel that towards something else. So what I'll do here is just explain the basic assumptions that fuel the futures that we design for the museum in the future. And I think these are really important to talk about in terms of like a museum that needs to constantly change and be aware of changes within technology, but also trends and policies and things like this. We felt it was really important to define a future and an interpretation of the future that was solid, so that within that solid framework you can have all sorts of flexibility and unpredictability. So these are kind of what the museum aspires to be. So the Museum of the Future seeks participants and not visitors. So this is, I mentioned this before, but the idea is really you as a visitor become a resident of these futures, and they only really make sense when you commit to them. Otherwise, they're sort of empty, dead futures. We're not forecasters, we're dreamers. So this is a very important thing to say, that the Museum of the Future is not a place where you go to find out like what you should invest in or what subject your kid should study. It's a place where you go to imagine what is possible and to recognize that enormous collective enterprises remain necessary and remain valid. A future built on timeless universal experience. We really wanted to make sure that when you came to the Museum of the Future, even if you were experiencing unfamiliar scenarios, unfamiliar technologies, the core of it was based on concerns that unite us all as people in this room, but also unite us with our descendants and with our ancestors. So those things remain. And then, of course, the nature of what you're doing is specific, but this is one of the ways we tried to sort of consolidate things. A future in which technology provides people with new abilities without replacing existing ones. So this is really a very active response to the feelings and anxieties that many people have about automation and these kinds of things, that somehow the march of technology is about flattening the human experience and making us less necessary and less empowered. We wanted to make sure that when we were referencing a technology like AI, it was done in a way that showed that it can actually expand what's possible for humans and not just contract it. A future that you would want to live in if you didn't know who you would be. So this is also a response to this assumption that the future is going to be wonderful as long as you have enough money to survive it, and that what technology is about and what art is about is basically creating better and better and more specific and more engaging toys for rich people. So we wanted to make sure that to the extent that we were showing progress, to the extent that we were showing development in our futures, it was a development that was translated out for the people with the least first and most. A future grounded in Dubai's values. So as I said before, Dubai government is the sort of patron of the project. It's an initiative of the Dubai Future Foundation. And I will say, in a way that I can't get into in a lot of detail, almost everything that we did was basically founded on policy priorities and sort of conceptual values of the people of Dubai and particularly of the government of Dubai. And I think this is a really important point to make, because especially when you talk about the future, thinking about the future, talking about the future, particularly in sort of science fiction, has been so dominated by Europe, America, and Japan for so long that it's really important and vital that new voices are added to those conversations, and then those new voices are speaking from their value system and not kind of adopting the value system of another place. A future focused on renewal rather than growth. This is also an extension of this issue of Dubai's values. Most people would assume Dubai is this mega wasteful place and et cetera, but actually Dubai's government and its approach to planning is entirely focused on, entirely is too strong a word, but is heavily focused on circularity, trying to find a way to continue to grow and to continue to be what it is, but not in the kind of wasteful way, the sort of model that has been worked on until now. A future based on fact, one of the things is we wanted to make sure that the sort of flights of fancy you experience in the museum are based on a true understanding of what's going on in science and technology and culture in general. A future in which science and spirituality support each other. This is also an extension of this notion of grounding it in Dubai's values. I think the sort of dichotomy or the sort of opposition between religion and science, or science and faith, is a false one, and it's one that in this part of the world doesn't hold at all. And I think that's something that we tried to make sure was explicit in the experiences that you have. And then finally, a future that's fundamentally optimistic but honest about the dangers of the present. So to the points that you were making, Shumon, in your opening, really the notion of being agnostic, being pessimistic, it's simply not, it's not really something that in any way we aspire to, and in a way what we're trying to do is come up with new languages and new messages and new experiences for people to tap into other feelings. Okay, so I'll just make another point. So the challenge, of course, with the museum is, or Museum of the Future, sorry, is how do you stay relevant? How do you keep changing? How do you make sure that you don't feel fixed? So one of the things is that we don't have a permanent collection. The exhibitions will change and evolve over time, and that was always the premise. But what we did instead of having a permanent collection is have permanent questions. And those questions kind of define how we develop new exhibitions. They define how we interpret different themes. And the thing is that if we can keep these permanent, keep these consistent, then we can collaborate with whomever we want. We can engage whatever topic we want. And the quality of the experience remains consistent regardless of aesthetics or regardless of whatever technique that we're using in a particular interaction. So, for example, in a way that is like was extremely tedious and annoying for all the designers, we had this slide for every single submission. Every single exhibit in the museum had to answer these questions. Where is the love in this piece? Where is its sense of awesomeness and revelation? How does it draw the audience in? How does it make them feel needed? Where is the work's sense of humor? Where is the past? So basically every significant thing in the museum had extremely laborious explanation of how it responded to these 6 questions. And as I say, these are kind of permanent questions rather than a permanent collection. And with these, you could theoretically introduce almost anything into the museum, and it would still have a kind of conceptual and emotional connection to the things around it, regardless of who made it. We also did things like this, rather than simply having the typical way that you would map a journey through time and through the kind of making sure you don't have pinch points and you have good throughput and all these kinds of engineering things. We did the same thing for the emotional quality of the experience. So for all the floors, we had a kind of emotional journey that we were hoping that we'd be able to kind of map. And then this allowed us to bring together, like in this floor, level 4 of the museum, there's 6 different studios contributing to it. So each one knew that they were participating in a certain chapter. And then we also knew what we were trying to achieve emotionally in terms of the visitor's experience in those particular moments, so that they could kind of understand how to adjust levels and tones. We also had to do this because we are a government institution. It's very important to know that when you are a government institution and you are coming from a cultural background, you will be working with stakeholders who do not care about emotional journeys, and they do not care about everything I just said. What they care about is a different set of things which are totally valid and important, and I'm in no way being dismissive, but I'm just saying all this making up new words, this isn't flying in the halls of Dubai government. So what I will say is that what we had to do instead is map out how you would learn about emerging technologies through the different experiences in the museum. So for every floor, we had to explain how these kinds of things, which people were vaguely curious about and would like to understand it better, how these are sort of embedded in a futuristic form in what you experience in the museum. And we also had to do the same thing for the UAE strategy for the 4th Industrial Revolution, which is a number of sort of areas of engagement related to emerging technologies. So all these things are kind of like in a subconscious way woven into what you're having, which is essentially a kind of experience of a fantasy environment, but embedded in these kinds of assumptions and policy priorities. So to your point about hardware and software. What I would say about the museum is that we are very committed to hardware. We're very committed to it being a physical experience. Of course, there's a tremendous amount of digital work. There's a tremendous amount of work which could be made into an NFT. But in the end, for us, the quality of it as a physical manifestation and as a physical experience that rewards your body being there and can only really be fully experienced in that way is really important for us. And so also in our choice of technologies and in the ways in which we presented things, we didn't go for the kinds of technologies everybody would assume you would go for, which is like AR, VR, et cetera. We went for things which are actually more established standard display technologies, but we then kind of wrap them up in a story and wrap them up in a sort of journey that made them feel fresh and new. And so this is one way also to future-proof yourself, because if we would have gone all in on AR, for example, because somebody decided that we should do that, we'd be feeling bad about it now, is what I'll say. So finally, this is one of the moments in the museum that we're most proud of. It's called the library. It's basically a kind of vault of life. Each one of these cylinders contains a genetic code of a species, and you as a visitor get to walk around it, get to explore it, and in one use case you can collect the DNA and then synthesize a speculative species based on combining strands of different species. And so again, in terms of like trying to create something which feels new and feels fresh and reminds people of what is possible, but at the same time feels kind of rooted in a sort of consistency and reminds us of a sort of timeless spectrum of life that we all sort of are part of. This is sort of one of those moments where we tried to create something which is beautiful and Instagrammable and all that sort of stuff, but also, although it is referencing things like AI, genetic engineering, biodesign, is also really about the things which pre-existed us and will continue long after we're here. And I think in terms of staying relevant, staying futuristic, that's kind of the key, and that's certainly where we've put most of our energy in the museum.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you. If you have any questions, if you put your hands up soon, and there'll be a mic that goes around. If you can speak into the mic, it's important for the recording, please. We've got a few minutes before we have to wrap up. Thank you so much. You all delivered exactly what I'd hoped, in the sense that I think, three very different models, three very different histories, three very different, maybe also arguably kinds of audiences that you might have idealized, let's say. But just, I want to sort of loop back to some of the things that Chiara presented. And again, this is something that I guess I'm familiar with from the inside of the institution of the Fondazione Prada. And it was something I felt very strongly when I was at the opening of Recycling Beauty a few weeks ago in Milan, which is a second show by this incredible classicist, Salvatore Settis. And I remember having to tell Mrs. Prada and Rem at dinner this famous sort of Soviet quote, which Payam Sharifi reminded me about, which is, if the past is uncertain, the future is certain. And there's a sense in which I think in projects like when attitudes become formed, the reenactment, and through these shows regarding classicism, that when we engage with the past and the deep past today, we obviously, we interpret and we process that in a completely different framework, no? And the meaning obviously has shifted, but there's a way in which I think both serial classics and Recycling Beauty, which are shows about antiquity ostensibly, end up being actually shows about the extreme present and also offering us pathways to think about the future. Do you think, and of course, Germano Cerlant, who sadly passed away early on during the pandemic, was somebody that was a great kind of essayist of history and of putting together these very sort of sweeping shows. But there was a sense in which I think every time he presented an artist like Kienholz from the 60s or 70s, it was rarely with a sense of nostalgia. There was always a sense in which, actually to use Lukas's phrase, they were constantly being updated. No? The artworks were being updated by our present condition. Would you agree there's something about a sort of commitment to the inquiry of the past that the Fondazione believes is a kind of unique way of thinking about the present?
Well, basically, I would say, as I said before, if the aim is learning, then you have to study, of course. So it's very important to work seriously on the past. Serial Classic was a show about seriality in classical art, basically copies, we would say today. Recycling Beauty is a show, it's now closed, a show about objects that had a different life through time. Basically, it was a show about appropriation art. So it's interesting if you can see an exhibition, and in the exhibition you see objects in a different perspective compared to where they usually are, let's say, in the permanent collection in a museum. So the perspective is very important if it leads you to understand that those topics are still relevant, sorry to say this again, also today. And the other side, I would say, is, while I don't feel comfortable at saying that the institution I work for is a predictive one, I do feel comfortable at saying that many artists have a predictive role. As I showed you, I think Elmgren Dragset made this abandoned office. They thought about it in 2017. That's kind of predictive. But also, in When Attitudes Become Form, there were works which were completely immaterial. As you mentioned, Sol LeWitt, there were works from the late and also early 60s, like Yves Klein, Ed Kienholz as well, which were certificates of works that didn't even exist, but were meant to be created for the collector. So it was just a certificate. And in the case of Yves Klein, you had to burn the certificate. So it went even further. So that's what I think it's really interesting. When you can work with people who do have this role, maybe they're not even aware of it, but you see it once you turn back and you look at the past.
And Lukas, I mean, it's true. You, yourself, rarely, to my knowledge, have used the word institution to describe what you do. It's something that I'm sort of playfully casting here. But in terms of thinking about your future, your growth, even where you want to be in a year, 5 years, the kinds of questions, of course, that VCs would ask. And you'd have to present in a deck. Do you think there is some attraction or some allure or some practical benefit of becoming more institutionalized in relation to thinking about your future and endeavor?
The question in my head is what does that mean? Like, what does institutionalization mean in an age where I can find out everything about your credibility by just looking at the kind of online archive of what happened. So there's this weird kind of continuous archivization going on today, where you don't have to be an institution to be an institution. Like if an institution means that you are a very kind of well-funded machine that thinks over 50 years, over a time frame of 50 years, then, my answer is like, no, actually, I think given our background in crypto, it's more about sitting into the proverbial roller coaster and, seeing where things go, because the time moves in exponential speed. Like what is valid today is completely invalid tomorrow and, revalidated 2 weeks later. So I'm not entirely sure how I should answer the question, because
for example,
the canonization
out of the three guests here, you don't have a physical premises as such. You have an office, but the work, if it's visited, if it's displayed, if it's communicated, is online, for example. Many avant-garde institutions, we did a lot of research at Fondazione Prada about how institutions start, didn't have physical premises for a long time. They were peripatetic, they were informal, they happened in people's bedrooms, etc., etc. The Guggenheim started actually in a hotel in New York, for example. At some point, in order to appear to have a certain kind of credibility, credibilities are often synonymous with a building, for example, with the physical premises. Now, I agree. I mean, crypto and the whole, what I call the 2.5 dimension challenges that, of course. But we're also seeing, as you said in one of your last slides, that the greater kind of connection now between traditional legacy institutions and crypto, which is a point of contention within the community or the different communities. Some people who say, well, this is a kind of sellout. Why do we need this? We're trying to build our own Elysium, et cetera, And then there are others that say that, well, actually, we need, this is a natural course of evolution and progress. So, it's in a way, one could take many institutional case studies and say there are these like touch points along a kind of timeline or a lifeline, which eventually, ends up with some kind of endowed, multi-billion-dollar corporation or something like that. No? So, I mean, how much? I guess the question is, do you completely disregard any of that? Because in a sense, you're part of a new kind of vector of possibilities, for example.
No, I think we don't disregard it at all. I think we're not as worried about space and a continuous place to execute ideas, because there is enough spaces around the globe that are interested in these ideas in the first place. And so the question becomes one of filtering people and finding the right institutions, so to speak, that have an interest in discovering online worlds and are willing to kind of, in a way, underwrite that discovery process and give a space for time. Give a space for a certain time. And so I think the idea of like a permanent space is incredibly far away. I think, up to my recollection, we haven't talked about it once, because there's been very few examples of something that is as fleeting as like the NFT crypto art community having a successful physical manifestation anywhere. And so I don't know if it's over time. I don't have an answer. Yeah. But we're not worried about it because there's enough space.
Yeah. Are there any questions from the audience? Anybody? If not, I've got one final question then for Brendan, which is, if there was a time, I don't know if it's still the case, but if you sat down on your Emirates airline seat and turned on the screen, there was an interview with you, and one of the things that really struck me towards the end of that interview, again, because I've known you for 20 years, is that, and you've echoed that, I think, really eloquently in your presentation, was a critique, let's say, that's my word, of a certain kind of pessimistic position in relation to the present and the future. And I'm curious whether that position of yours was something, how much of that had been shaped by, arriving here in Dubai and working on this incredible project and having to think about the future as framed through the present. And as you said very importantly, not only creating a new kind of institutional or, let's say, architectural precedent, which is a museum of the future, but that is one that is situated here, right? And as you said, that wants to self-identify as being outside of an Occidental canon, no? In the same way, I mean, that first opening shot in Black Panther, where it's not the opening shot, it's sort of a few minutes in after the first scene, but where the ship pierces the kind of holographic projection, and then you enter into Wakanda. I still find it a really moving image of a kind of alternative Afrofuturism, no? And we've had Gulf futurism, we have continental vibe, we have many brewing kind of alternatives, it seems to me, about what a kind of non-Western or non-Occidental future might be. But yeah, I'm curious how your own agnosticism or agnostic-mysticism was shaped through the process of working on this project.
Well, I think, I mean, I've always felt that dystopia, you know, as valuable as it is a really easy way out. Mm-hmm. Just creatively, I mean, it's very easy to go, oh, isn't this a messed up situation? Let's, you know, multiply that by 10. So the kind of need to then intervene and push something that's going in one direction and another direction, I always found like more inspiring as a point of view. But what I will say about Dubai is, one of the things that really, you know, made an impression on me is the fact that, you know, so much has been achieved here in such a limited amount of time and against really, really difficult odds. I was actually just speaking to somebody yesterday when they were talking to me about the climate floor. And one of the things that's really, I think is really interesting about subjects like climate change here is that there was never a good climate. So it's not like Europe where it's like, oh no, what happens if we, you know,
our balmy summers.
You've been barely able to, you know, you've had to figure out a way to make it work in a very, very harsh environment forever. So that gives you a very different perspective on things like that, and it makes it clear that things are possible and that, you know, collective effort and ingenuity and resilience are things that you simply need. And they're not things that, you know, suddenly we realize have become very relevant. So that, to me, is a really like inspiring point of view. And I also just think that the fact that so much has happened here so quickly just provides, in a way, like a proof of concept of optimistic thinking. So it's not like if I were to be doing a museum in the future exactly the way it is in Europe or America or something, you'd need some big crazy polemic to wrap it in about, like, you know, a response to Brexit or something. You don't have to do any of that here, because the default assumption is that just as great things have been achieved and risks were taken and sacrifices were made and mistakes were made, but in the end, a kind of something generated itself from almost nothing that can keep happening. And it requires the same level of risk-taking, commitment, etc. But it's possible. And that, as a kind of raw material for any sort of institution or creative work, is extremely valuable. And so that's the thing that I tried to tap into and tried to really absorb. And certainly during COVID, it was massively important because everybody was having like their own breakdowns. And I felt really proud that when we were doing this project, that all the different collaborators we had, who were all going through different points on the timeline, I could say to them, guys, you know, the museum is going to happen, and we can't take the easy way out. We have to figure out a way to generate things that are coming from a place of optimism, a place of love, a place of belief. So let's do that. And I think for a lot of us, that was kind of a therapeutic thing, because otherwise it's like you look around, it's like I used to have these Zoom calls with people, and they're like mid-breakdown, basically. And then you're going like, can I give you some feedback on the latest submission? You're just like, what is this? So anyway, yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Yeah, do we have a microphone, please? Can we just thank you.
Dubai doesn't have a museum, and having a museum of future, I just want to bring this up, and I want to have a little bit of input about it. Which one? No, I mean museums like. No, Jamil Art Center is yeah. But what I mean is
Yes,
like
it is.
yes. But what I mean is like something like Louvre or some, like a collection. We have what are the other? We
No,
do.
there is a Dubai collection.
Yeah,
No,
but
yeah.
does it? Do we
But
see?
are you saying, does it need to be an
I mean, we
international
don't-
brand?
No, not a necessarily international brand. Something that we see the changes, we see the new exhibitions. Even at Louvre, like in compared to the other parts of the world, the exhibitions, how often does it change? You see, I don't know which museum would we call it for Dubai? Which museum? I mean, Jamil Art Center.
Well, there's Jamil Art Center.
Yeah, but Jamil Art Center for me is it a museum? Is it Antonio, do you consider it as a museum?
Why would it not be?
Yeah.
No, I think. No, not to dismiss you. I mean, I think it's we could definitely have a session about that, but I would argue that just because you don't have the word kind of appended to a particular institution, that there aren't the functions. I would argue across Tashkil, Al Sarkal Avenue, even Art Dubai, all together it creates an ecology of activities that provide what museums provide. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you. Please join me in thanking Lukas, Chiara, and Brendan.